Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I used to be an avid mountain biker, the kind who lived for the adrenaline rush of conquering challenging trails and pushing my limits. I had been doing this for over a decade, building up quite the reputation in the local biking community. At my peak, I was a solid 160 pounds of mostly muscle, especially in my forearms and hands from all the handlebar work. That was until 3 months ago. I was attempting a certain tricky descent I'd done countless times before. Maybe I got too comfortable. Maybe I was just having an off day. Whatever it was, I miscalculated the jump, and the next thing I knew, I was airborne in the wrong way. The crash was bad enough that they had to bring in a helicopter to airlift me to the nearest trauma center. The doctors later told me I was lucky to be alive. They had to perform emergency surgery, cutting me open from neck to groin to stop the internal bleeding. Now I have this gnarly scar that looks like someone took a 3-foot earthworm, ironed it flat, and stapled it to my torso. Pretty metal if you ask me, though I could have done without the near-death experience. I spent 2 weeks in intensive care, during which the staff was incredibly kind and professional. Every nurse, doctor, and orderly treated me with such care and respect, even though I was basically a human jigsaw puzzle at that point. By some miracle, I pulled through and they finally moved me to a regular hospital room. By then, I had lost about 40 pounds, leaving me at a measly 120. I could barely sit up without help, and everything hurt. That's when I met her, this huge nurse who looked like she'd been specially ordered from Mean Medical Staff Monthly. She came in with a group of other medical personnel for what I assumed would be a routine checkup. Without any warning or even a word of explanation, she yanked down my sheet and practically ripped up my hospital gown, exposing my rather unfortunate-looking private parts to everyone in the room. The way she did it, it was clear she was trying to establish some sort of dominance, like I was just another piece of meat for her to process. In her gruff and commanding voice, she announced that they needed to check my motor functions. After manhandling me for a few more moments, she held out her hand and ordered me to squeeze it as hard as I could. Now, I may have been down, but I wasn't out. Mountain biking builds specific kinds of strengths, and grip strength is one of them. All those years of handling rough terrains and maintaining control over my bike had given me hands of steel. Looking at my emaciated state, I could tell she wasn't expecting much. I took her plump, squishy hand in mine and began to squeeze. I kept my face completely neutral, not showing any strain or effort. At first she looked bored, then confused. Then suddenly her eyes widened. She started yelling in pain, demanding that I stop and let go of her hand. She started trying to pull her hand away, but I maintained the same steady pressure, watching as she frantically attempted to free herself. The other medical staff, who had been quietly observing until now, started to look concerned. One of the other nurses gently suggested that maybe I should let go, while the doctor remarked with surprise about how impressive my strength was. I finally released her hand, and she immediately cradled it against her chest, looking at me with a mixture of shock and indignation. She angrily declared that what I did was completely unnecessary. I responded by pointing out that exposing me to the entire room without warning or consent had been equally unnecessary. The doctor, trying to hide what looked suspiciously like a smirk, cleared his throat and suggested that perhaps they should continue the examination with a different approach. The mean nurse, getting more agitated, threatened to file a report about the incident. I told her to go ahead, adding that I'd also like to file one about proper patient dignity and consent protocols. The other nurses in the room were very obviously trying not to laugh now. Mean nurse's face had turned deep red as she stormed out of the room. The remaining staff finished their examination with perfect professionalism, and I noticed they were careful about maintaining my dignity. The next day I had a new nurse assigned to my care, and I never saw Mean Nurse again. Apparently she had requested to be transferred to a different ward, but that moment, as painful as it was for her, was actually a turning point in my recovery. It showed me that despite everything my body had been through, my spirit was still intact. I might have looked like a weak, broken man, but inside, I was still the same strong mountain biker who could crush a technical descent without breaking a sweat. Over the next few weeks, that realization helped drive my rehabilitation. Every time I felt like giving up during physical therapy, I remembered the look on me nurse's face and pushed just a little harder. I've been a pediatrician for 15 years now, and I absolutely love my job. There's nothing more rewarding than helping children and seeing them recover from illness or injury. My son was actually one of the reasons I chose this specialty. He was diagnosed with autism when he was 3, and the experience of navigating the healthcare system with him made me want to be the kind of doctor I wished we'd had. My son is brilliant with numbers and can solve complex math problems that would stump most adults. But social situations are challenging for him, and he struggles with eye contact and understanding social cues. I've always taught him to be proud of who he is, but middle school has been incredibly difficult. It started about 6 months ago when this kid, let's just call him the bully, decided my son would be his favorite target. At first, it was just verbal taunts, mocking the way my son would sometimes flap his hands when excited or how he'd recite math equations to calm himself down. When I asked my son if he was having trouble at school again, his response broke my heart. He told me that the bully had called him weird and had told everyone not to talk to him because he was a freak. When I asked if he had told his teacher about it, he said she had just told him to ignore it. I tried everything. I had meetings with the teachers, the guidance counselor, the principal. Their response was always the same. The principal gave me the typical line about how they take bullying very seriously, but unless there's physical violence, there's only so much they can do. They'd keep an eye on the situation, they said. The guidance counselor was even worse, suggesting that maybe my son was misinterpreting normal teenage behavior because of his condition. The situation kept escalating. My son started having meltdowns before school, something that hadn't happened since elementary. The bully had started tripping him in the hallways and knocking his books down. Still, the school did nothing substantial. Then one Saturday morning, while I was working my weekend shift at the clinic, guess who comes limping through the door? The bully, accompanied by his mother, the most entitled woman I'd ever met. I'll just call her Karen. She burst in demanding immediate attention for her precious baby who had fallen during soccer practice. She even tried to intimidate me by mentioning that her husband was on the school board. I maintained my professional demeanor, but inside my blood was boiling. This was the kid who had been terrorizing my son for months, and now he was in my care. I told her I would take a look at his leg. The x-rays showed a clean break that needed to be set. Normally, I'd administer a strong dose of pain medication before the procedure, but I had another idea. I gave him just enough to take the edge off. Completely safe and within medical guidelines, but not enough to fully block the pain. Karen questioned whether I should give him more pain medication. I explained in my most professional tone that this was the standard dose for his age and weight, and we didn't want to risk over-medication. The bully screamed during the procedure when I set his leg. Karen was frantically holding his hand, shooting daggers at me with her eyes. Her son begged me to make the pain stop. I simply told him to try to stay still, adding that sometimes pain helps us learn important lessons. I made sure to do everything by the book. The leg was set perfectly, and he received proper aftercare instructions. But he felt every manipulation, every adjustment, just a fraction of the pain he'd been inflicting on my son. The next week, I heard Karen had complained about me to the hospital administration, claiming I had been unnecessarily rough with her precious son. But since I had followed all proper medical procedures and documented everything meticulously, nothing came of it. The real satisfaction came 2 weeks later. The bully was still on crutches when I picked up my son from school one day. My son excitedly told me that the bully had tried to trip him again, but had fallen because of his crutches. For once, everyone had laughed at the bully instead of my son. Shortly after that incident, a spot opened up at a private school known for its excellent STEM program and zero-tolerance bullying policy. I enrolled my son immediately. He's thriving there now, surrounded by kids who appreciate his brilliant mind and unique perspective. I later heard that the bully's soccer injury had ended his chances of making the competitive team he'd been bragging about joining. Karen apparently threw a massive fit at the school board meeting, demanding they change their sports eligibility requirements just for her son. They refused. My son still occasionally sees the bully at the local mall or grocery store, but now the bully always seems to develop a noticeable limp whenever he spots us, hurrying away in the opposite direction. I've been an avid hunter since I was a kid, learning everything from my dad, who taught me about respecting wildlife and responsible hunting. When Florida passed a new law about hunting invasive species, I knew it would make for a perfect father-son activity during my visit to my parents in Fort Lauderdale. My parents have lived in this 55-plus community for over 2 decades now. It's one of those places that's mostly empty during the summer because most owners are Canadians who only show up for 3 months during winter to escape the cold. Out of over 400 apartments, only about 100 have year-round residents, including my parents. The iguana problem in Fort Lauderdale is no joke. These invasive lizards are everywhere, destroying local vegetation and infrastructure. So when I visited my parents last week, I brought my air rifle, planning to help control the iguana population around their community. My dad and I did everything by the book. We called the local authorities, got our permits verified, and told them about our planned hunting activities around the canal. Everything was going smoothly until this woman showed up. Picture this. I'm lining up a shot at a large iguana when I hear flip-flops slapping against the pavement at high speed. This woman comes charging at us from the pool area, her beach towel barely hanging on, wearing this enormous floppy hat that made her look like she was auditioning for a summer beach commercial. She immediately started yelling at us to stop what we were doing. When I explained that we were hunting invasive iguanas and it was completely legal, she got even more agitated. She started bragging about being on the Homeowners Association board and insisted we were disturbing everyone with the noise, claiming it was private property. My dad, who has the patience of a saint but also a great sense of humor, just started laughing. He told her that he'd lived there for 20 years and that we'd already notified the police about our hunting activities, assuring her everything was completely legal. She threatened to call the police and have us arrested for trespassing before storming off, nearly losing her flip-flops in the process. My dad and I just shrugged and continued our hunting. We had a job to do, and we were doing it right. About 20 minutes later, we heard sirens. Multiple police cars and an ambulance came screaming into the community. At first, I was confused about why there was an ambulance, but it all made sense later. The responding officers approached us calmly, mentioning they'd received a call about our hunting activities. My dad showed them the documentation and the time we had called in earlier to notify authorities. The officers were actually pleased to see people helping with the iguana problem and asked if they could take pictures of our catches. We had gotten 32 iguanas over 2 days, which impressed the officers. But here's where it gets interesting. While we were chatting with the police, another officer pulled my dad aside and explained what had really happened. Turns out Karen had called a different police district and reported an active shooter situation. That's why the ambulance showed up. Standard procedure for an active shooter call. The officers were not amused. They went to speak with Karen and we could see her getting more agitated by the minute. The officers explained that she had no authority to stop us from hunting, especially since the canals and waterways are under Florida state control. They also told her that air rifles are specifically authorized because they don't cause disturbances. She got slapped with a citation for making false reports. The officers also gave her a stern warning about confronting people with firearms, even if it was just an air rifle. They reminded her that as a temporary resident, she should handle things through proper channels instead of taking matters into her own hands. Karen just stood there, getting redder and redder with each word from the officers. My dad couldn't stop grinning. 20 years of dealing with entitled snowbirds who think they own the place, and he finally got to see one face consequences for their actions. The officers stayed around for a bit, actually interested in our hunting technique and the iguana problem. They shared stories about other incidents they'd handled involving invasive species. Meanwhile, Karen retreated to her apartment, but not before giving us one final death glare from her balcony. We continued our hunt for the rest of the week without any further interruptions. Every time we passed the pool, the chair where Karen usually sat was conspicuously empty. I guess some people just can't handle being wrong. I'm a 50-year-old father of 3, and I'm currently in the middle of what you might call a family crisis. Let me give you some background. My wife and I had our first daughter when we were both 16. Young and scared, but determined to make it work. Our parents were incredibly supportive, helping us finish college while raising our little girl. It wasn't easy, but we managed. When our oldest was ready for college, we were broke. No savings, nothing to help her with. She took out student loans and worked her way through school. She stayed with us to save money and managed to pay off her loans in just 3 years after graduating. She helped us raise her younger siblings, never complained about babysitting, and was always there when we needed her. Her siblings came along later when we were more financially stable. We learned from our experience and saved up college funds for both of them, about $100,000 each. They graduated debt-free while their older sister had to struggle through loans. 5 years ago, when our oldest told us she was getting married, I felt this overwhelming guilt. Here was our daughter who had sacrificed so much, never complained, and we had never been able to do anything substantial for her. I had recently inherited $50,000 from my grandmother, and after talking with my wife, we decided to give it to our oldest to help with her wedding and house down payment. That's where the drama begins. My middle daughter is getting married next year, and she just assumed we'd give her the same amount. When I told her we didn't have that kind of money, she lost it. She demanded to know how we didn't have the money when we had given it to her sister. I explained it was different because it was inheritance money. She argued that it wasn't fair, pointing out that her sister didn't even need the money since she and her husband had already paid off their house and were doing well financially. I tried to explain that this wasn't about how much money her sister had, but rather about finally being able to do something for our oldest after she had to struggle through everything because we had her so young. She took this completely wrong, asking if she was being punished because we had our lives together when we had her. When I reminded her that she got a $100,000 college fund while her sister had student loans and that we'd spend twice as much on her and her brother as we ever did on her sister, she just insisted that college was different from a wedding gift. She stormed out after that conversation and hasn't spoken to us since. She's even keeping my wife out of the wedding preparations. My wife is devastated and wants to take out a loan to give her the money, but I refuse. The situation got even more complicated when my oldest called me. She offered to help by paying half of what her sister was asking for. I refused, explaining that this wasn't about the money anymore, but about her sister's attitude. She asked if this was really worth breaking up the family over, but I told her that at this point, I'd rather burn $50,000 than give it to her sister. This sense of entitlement needs to stop. My wife keeps saying we should just give in to keep the peace, but I won't budge. Yesterday, my middle daughter sent a group text to the entire family. In it, she sarcastically announced that since we clearly favored our struggling oldest child, she would just have a small wedding without any family present, hoping we'd all be happy with that. That's when my youngest finally spoke up in the group chat. He called out his sister's behavior, asking if she was really throwing a tantrum over not getting $50,000 after we had paid for her entire college education. He called the whole thing embarrassing. She left the group chat after that. Now my wife is crying every day, my oldest is trying to play peacemaker, and I'm sitting here wondering how I raised such an entitled child. I won't cave though. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.